Once we've taken inventory of all of our pieces, we're going to go ahead and we're going to identify all of our placements. So we've got a pocket placement back off, which is classically a 1/4 inch in and a 1/4 inch down. We also have our dart back offs, 1/2 inch from the vanishing points, 1/8 of an inch in from kind of the belly of the dart. In this case, it's a fisheye dart, with the same thing on both sides. And then I also like to do tailor tacks for our buttons and buttonholes. In the commercial world, we'll use a sloper after we're done with the garment, and that'll tell us where to get them placed. But if I'm doing custom work or I'm doing work at home, if I do that up front, I don't have to think about it later. I've fused my upper collar, I've also fused my cuffs. And once you've done that, what you want to do is go back through and trim away the excess interfacing so that it doesn't compete for your seam allowances. I'm ready to do my fronts, and I can do the front facings exactly like I've done the cuffs on the upper collar. I can simply fuse it to the back of the fabric, trim away the excess, and then we can come up with a solution for finishing this edge here. One of those solutions would simply be to roll the fabric to the back 1/8 of an inch and then to edge stitch so that we hold that edge back and we get a really nice clean finish. The other alternate, and you'll see this a lot in the commercial world, is where they simply overlock the edge there, and that keeps it durable and stable over time. I have another technique that I like to do, and I'm going to show that to you because it's not particularly complicated, but it gives a very nice soft finish. So what we're going to do is we're going to place the interfacing so that it's face up. We're going to place the fabric so that it's face down. And we're going to align those edges. And what we're going to do is we're going to take it to the sewing machine and we're going to sew 1/8 of an inch away from the edge, attaching the interfacing to the facing of the garment. Once we've done that, we're going to roll it to the other side, and I'll show that to you in just a moment. I've sewn the fusible interfacing to the facing of the front self, face up, and then the glue side up, 1/8 of an inch away from the edge here. Now I'm going to go ahead and understitch. What the understitching does is secure the facing, or in this case the interfacing, and the seam allowances to one edge, and what that does is actually help the edges to roll more successfully. So I'm going to take it to the sewing machine, I'm going to hold a little bit of tension, make certain my seam allowances are facing toward my interfacing, and I'm going to edge stitch a 1/16 of an inch away from the edge. I've edge stitched a 1/16 of an inch away from the edge to understitch the interfacing to the garment, and I've captured my seam allowances. Now I'm going to roll this to the back. I'm going to take it to the iron and I'm going to press. I'm going to start at my seam right there, helping it along, and I'm going to press along here to get this in shape, and then I'll go ahead and press the rest of my interfacing to adhere it to the garment to give it stability across the front, and we'll trim any excess that we have away. When you're completed, this is what it will look like. So we have a very soft finished edge here. When we look at the back, it's very clean finished as well. Our front facings are interfaced on both sides. Our placement for our buttons and buttonholes are identified. Our pocket back off is identified as well. And finally, we have our darts. We're going to go ahead and sew those now before we attach our pocket and begin construction. We have fisheye darts. They're going to start at a point. They're going to come to the widest position of roughly center, and then they come back to a point. We're going to start where the back offs are, 1/2 inch beyond. We're going to come to 1/8 inch out, right about the belly area, and then we're going to come back and conclude at a point 1/2 inch beyond the back off on this side as well. Once we've completed the darts, we'll press them towards center front, and we're ready for our next step. Now that our front darts are sewn and pressed towards center front, we're ready to place our pocket. So we're going to prepare our pocket first. What I've done is I've taken a template that's the size of my pocket without my seam allowances. And then in order to get nice clean curves, I've placed it in here, and I've used this hard edge to give me a nice secure edge all the way around. Once that's done, I'm going to edge stitch at the top of the hem, right at the top of the pocket, and finish that up, and then we're ready to place. Normally I try to match my stripes when I'm working with a striped fabric with the pocket placement. However, in this case, the dart is forcing the stripes to come together, and so if I tried to align them, I could align them at the top, but they wouldn't align at the bottom, and that would make it look a little distorted. So I offset the stripes for that purpose. The other choice is simply to go horizontally with the stripes, and that way I get a design choice, an element here that doesn't compete for my eye. So I'm going to use my pocket back offs, which are 1/4 inch in and 1/4 inch down from the top of the pocket. I'm going to place it, and I'm going to do a little triangle stitch at the top. So I'm going to start at the hem, come in at 1/4 inch, pivot, come to the side. I'm going to edge stitch all the way around. Here at the top again, I'll pivot, come in at 1/4 inch, and then come down to the hem and back stitch, giving me a nice, complete, clean finish at the top. Our pocket is placed. Now we're ready to take care of the shoulders. What we're going to do first is we're going to find our notches right here and here, and 1/4 inch away from the edge and 5/8 inch away from the edge we're going to run gathering stitches, the longest stitch the machine will make, in order to shear this up or gather it into places so it will align and connect to our shoulder seams at the back yoke. Our front shoulder seams have been gathered and they are set to go, so we'll set them aside. We're going to prepare the back so that we can attach it to the back yoke. We're going to find notches on both left and right side. They're about 1 inch apart, and we're going to take a knife pleat and bring those notches together and lay them like this. And we want the fold so that it's facing toward the side seam or the armhole. We're just going to stay stitch that in place there, and we'll do the same thing over here. We'll bring these notches together, bring the fold so it faces the side seam, and stay stitch that as well. So the knife pleats for the back of our shirt have been stay stitched into place, just 1/4 inch away from the edge. That stitching will be hidden later on by our yoke. Now we're ready to attach our yoke. Faces together, we're going to align the edge of the back with the yoke, aligning our notches side to side, and then we will sew it 1/2 inch and press all the seam allowances toward the yoke. To prepare for my shoulder gathers, I run 2 rows of basting stitches, one 1/4 inch away from the edge, one 5/8 inch away from the edge. My seam allowance is at 1/2 inch, that way those basting threads will come out easily. I've run the stitch length of the long stitch my machine will make, and I've pinned from notch to notch, and this is the area that I want to gather up. So I'm going to grab threads on one end and just pull on them lightly to start gathering up the fabric. You'll hear the term gathering, shearing, or ruching. And it's all kind of the same thing. And we want them equally distributed. So we're snug it up so it's the same distance as we have on the back shoulder seam. And once I'm happy, I'll go ahead and put a couple more pins in to keep them from moving around too much. And then we're ready for sewing. Again, seam allowance is 1/2 inch, back stitch beginning and end. And when you're sewing, you can either keep the gathers on the top, so the back side of the fronts face up, or from the back. It's simply a matter of preference. Sometimes sewing from the front you can see the gathers better, and you can better distribute them as you're sewing across them. You'll have better control. Now that we've sewn the front shoulder seams to the shoulder seams of the yoke, we're going to go ahead and attach the shoulder seams of the yoke lining or yoke facing to the front facings. So if you kind of lay them like this, it may make better sense. We want the curvature part here, the inside edge of the neck, to align right there. And we're going to pin that in place and sew it at 1/2 inch. You'll only be capturing the facing, and so part of the yoke is going to show, right? We're going to do the same thing over here and connect that right there and sew those together. You add 1/2 inch. And then we're ready for the next step. Now it's time to attach the upper collar to the under collar. In this case, I've taken my upper collar and I've cut it so that the stripes are horizontal to the edge, and I've fused interfacing to the back side of it. My under collar has vertical stripes. There is no fusing on this one. What I do want to point out to you is that the under collar is smaller than the upper collar. It typically will come in about 1/8 inch smaller at the point, and then go back to 0, 1/8 inch, go back to 0 here. And so we want to make certain that those edges actually align. So when I get ready to sew this, I'm going to place them so that the points match up both ends, and then I will ease that extra fabric into place along that area. Okay? It's very important. And in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to align the points, the center back seam right there, and then the other point, so that I distribute that ease equally. And I'm going to sew it at 1/4 inch. We've understitched with the seam allowances pressed toward the undercollar on the undercollar fabric, 1/16 from the edge. And what that's going to do is when we roll this to the face side eventually, again, it'll force those seam allowances to wrap underneath as well, so we get a nice clean finish here. What we're going to do now, faces together again, align the bottom points right here at the collar, and align those edges, and keep the seam allowances running toward the undercollar. You'll notice again that the seam allowance is ever so slightly, about almost 1/8 of an inch away from the edge over here, and that's going to keep it wrapped to the underneath when we get ready to turn it face out. We'll sew it 1/4 inch away from the edge. We'll trim some of the allowance away, and then we'll turn it face out. The edges of our collar have been sewn together. Seam allowances rolled toward the undercollar. Reduce some of this bulk. I like to come in and trim right here first, so I'm just going to clip that out of the way. And then we're going to clip on the diagonal toward the stitching but not through it. We want to be very close, but don't get too aggressive about that. I'm going to take just a little bit more of this out of here, however. That'll make that corner very sharp and clean. Clip to the stitches but not through them. You can always trim more fabric away, don't forget, so don't get too aggressive about that if you're not sure. We're going to press the seam allowances open before we turn it face out. That'll help those seam allowances to roll better and lay flatter. We're going to turn it. And you can use your point turn if you like. I like to use my stiletto and get in here and just lightly pull it face out until we get to that point. Be careful here. You can pull it forward so much that you actually pull a little hole in the corner, so you want to be careful about that. We want those corners to be nice and sharp and not to be a big glob of fabric in there. Do the same thing on the other side. Open up the seam allowances first. And then lift into that corner. Once you're happy with the corner points, or the collar points, we'll go ahead and give it a press. And then favor everything to the undercollar. So we want to make sure those seam allowances wrap ever so slightly to the undercollar so we don't see them. And press away from the collar points towards center on both ends. That'll make a nicer finish. Once you've done that, then we're going to stay stitch the open edge 1/8 of an inch away from that edge, just to anchor it. Our collar's been prepared and it's ready to attach to the garment. Now this part can be a little cumbersome and feel a little odd. And the instructions tell you to do this all as one step. I'm going to suggest that we do it as 2 steps. It makes it a little bit easier. So the first thing to do is find our center back notches for the undercollar. We're going to place the undercollar on top of the back yoke, faces together. So the face down on the undercollar, so that the undercollar is right against the back yoke, aligning our notches. We're going to go ahead and pin that in place first. Once we've established center back, then what we're going to do is we're going to find our shoulder notch. There'll be another notch here that aligns directly to our shoulder. The difficulty is that we have a concave and a convex curve coming together, so you just have to kind of tease them together. Then we're going to attach the end of our collar right to center front. So you have 3 notches. You have 1 notch that indicates where the fold back is, and you have center front. So we want that first notch that we come in contact with to align to the end of our collar. And we're going to pin that in place. We'll do the same thing on the other side. Align our shoulder notch first. Now make sure when you're doing this that all your seam allowances are pressed toward the yoke, away from the front of the garment. come here and find our first notch. Pin that in place. If you need more pins, feel free to pin more. Now what I'm going to suggest, because the instructions tell us to go ahead and sandwich it right between and pin everything together and sew it in one swoop at 1/4 of an inch. That does work. However, it may be more successful for you to first anchor this by stay stitching it in place 1/8 of an inch away from the edge where we've got it pinned, then sandwiching it, pinning it again, and sewing it 1/4 of an inch. And that's what I'm going to do here. I'm going to go ahead and take it over to the sewing machine and stay stitch it in place 1/8 of an inch away from the edge, making sure that all my notches align. So we've basted our collar into place, close to the edge here, and I used what I call a stay stitch. I simply sewed it into place. I'm not going to take the stitching out later on. It's 1/8 of an inch, so it'll be covered by my next set of stitches, which are going to be at 1/4 of an inch. What I'm going to do is place faces together, wrap that back over. I'm going to align my center back notches first thing, and pin those in place. I'm going to align my shoulder notches, making sure that everything, all the seam allowances wrap toward the yoke. Finally, I'm going to align the front notches. You're going to see that they extend a little bit beyond where we were initially. And it's going to feel a little odd, but that's going to create the lapel at the very front of the garment. So we align our notches, pin in place. And once we have it all pinned in place, now we'll sew it at 1/4 inch away from the edge all the way around. And then we will clip and grade our seam allowances to reduce some bulk. Now the best way to think about this next step, and it's not complicated or difficult, it's simply odd, is we want to go ahead and attach the yoke shoulder line of the facing to the shoulder line of the garment. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to place it faces together. So we're just opening it up. We're matching up our seam allowances at the shoulder seams of both the back yoke and the back yoke lining. And what we're going to do is we're going to sew is from the shoulder seam at the arm side toward the neckline as far as we can successfully. We're going to follow right along our last set of stitches. And so if you can capture, go as far as the facing piece where it's been sewn in, that'll be pretty good. So I would say you can get in about 2 to 2.5 inches, and then you can go ahead and stop. We'll do the same thing on both sides. So again, just to show you, here's what it's going to look like when it's completed. And all we're doing is we're rolling this forward, aligning all of our seam allowances. So there'll be 3 seam allowances: the back yoke shoulder, the front shoulder seam, and the back yoke facing or lining shoulder seam. Everything's sandwiched together, and we're going to sew as far as we can toward the neckline until we can't go any further and stop. We'll take it off the machine at that point and complete the other side. Now that our yokes are encasing the shoulder seams, we're ready to finish the lower seam of the back yoke, and this is going to eventually encase the bottom seam like that. The way we perform this is what we call a burrito roll. So we're going to do it, place it face up, bring the fronts of your garment out to the sides, and end up being kind of where the arm sides are. Here's our yoke facing, and here's our back yoke. What we want to do is we want to sandwich everything in between those two. So we're going to roll up from the bottom of the shirt at the back toward the back yoke until we get past the seam allowance. Once we get that seam allowance, we're going to take the yoke facing, the inside yoke, and pull those seam allowances together. We're going to align our notches, our raw edges, and we're going to sew on our prior sewing line all the way across, and we'll be encasing the entire garment between those 2 yokes at the bottom seam. Once we've sewn that, we'll go ahead and pull everything out through one end, and we'll have a clean finished garment. So we sewed the yokes together at the seam allowance that intersects with the back of the shirt, and it feels a little unbelievable, but we actually are going to turn it face out. So we're just going to start pulling from one end carefully. everything will start to come forward. There we are. It's kind of a wrinkled mess at this point, but now we can go ahead and give it a nice press, and we can check to verify that everything is laying nicely. What we'll do is, once we've done that, we'll go ahead and edge stitch here, and I'm going to do a 1/4 inch stitch, and I'm also going to do one at my shoulder seam at a 1/4 inch, just to give it a nice finish. Now that our yoke is in place and everything is pressed nicely, we're ready to start our sleeves. To sew the continuous or bound placket for the sleeve at the sleeve hem, we have two different options. We can do it as a French binding, or we can do it as an outside binding. Either way works. The outside binding is a little bit easier to achieve, so we'll do that one. In this case, what I want to do is I always like to press down my leading edge. It makes my life a little easier, so I press that in a 1/4 inch. Now that I've done that, I'm going to leave my sleeve face up. I'm going to take my placket binding face up as well, and I'm going to line this edge right there at the beginning. Now the thing that makes this complicated, and it's not particularly complicated, is that it's a little deceiving. What you're going to do is you're going to line this edge here, and then you're going to come to the point there, and you're not going to be able to get right to the edge. So you're not going to be able to line the entire edge parallel with the edge of the binding. It's going to be a very slight angular point here, so a long chevron, think of it that way, or an elongated V. And what we want to do is we want to line the ends precisely. And what's going to happen right at the point, we're only going to catch a few threads. So we're going to sew it a 1/4 inch using the binding as our guide, and right where we get to that point where it turns, we're going to catch just a couple of threads and then continue on. It is very important that you catch some threads here, however, otherwise you'll have a raw edge. So we'll sew this at a 1/4 inch, and once we've done that, we'll continue our binding process. So we've sewn our binding into place. It's captured just a couple of threads here at the intersection of the valley of the V, let's call it that. Then what we're going to do is press those to the face, right, and over. We're going to wrap it to the top. We're going to cover our prior stitching, and then we're going to edge stitch it in place. Again, coming right close to this intersection right here. Be very careful you don't get too deep, otherwise you get a pinch there or a pucker. And we'll complete that, and there's a couple more steps and we're done. So we've sewn the binding in place for the continuous placket. From the face side, edge stitching it. One more step here. We're going to fold it faces together, or outsides together, wrong sides out, whatever makes sense to you. What we're going to do is from that little fold to a 45-degree angle, we're going to sew right there to anchor those together. We've sewn the strip together at the point here on a 45-degree angle. That does us anchor them so they stay together. And finally, before we get ready to sew the sleeve into place, we're going to fold this so that the upper sleeve, the larger portion here, folds back on itself. This one stays like that, and it covers nicely right there. What we're going to do is just stay stitch this in place. The final step in preparation for our sleeve being attached to the garment are simply to place our pleats. At the hem edge of the sleeve, we've got notch points that we're going to bring together. We're going to find this notch here. I'm going to bring it toward the placket opening to the other notch. And it'll pleat there, and we'll stay stitch that. And we have one more. You'll find either 2 or 3 pleats typically on a sleeve. In this case, we have 2 on this side, and sometimes there'll be 1 on the undersleeve. And we'll stay stitch those both in place, and then we're ready to attach the sleeve to the garment. Our sleeves are prepared and ready to attach to the garment. We're going to do flat felt seams for the arm side. We're also going to do flat felt seams for the side seams. However, when we place the arms, we're going to do a 3/8 inch finished. So what we want to do is we're going to place faces together. We're going to align our notches. We're going to pin those in place, but when we're sewing, we're going to have the sleeve on the bottom face up. We'll have the garment face down against the sleeve, and we'll expose 3/8 of an inch of the sleeve itself at the side seam. We'll be sewing the top, or the garment itself, the arm side, at 1/4 of an inch, and so that'll allow us a 5/8 inch total, and then we'll wrap it to the back. That'll give us a complete finish when we're all done of 3/8. It's a lot of math, but it'll make sense when we get there. So again, expose 3/8 of an inch, align your notches, your shoulder notch. And on the bed of the sewing machine, again, the edge of the sleeve will be at 5/8. The edge of the foot will be basically at the 1/4 inch, will be right at the edge of the fabric here. We've sewn the sleeve to the armhole of the garment, and we had a 1/4 inch seam allowance on the garment portion. We had 5/8 inch of a seam allowance on the sleeve, exposing 3/8 of an inch as we sewed. We're going to go ahead and lay it and press the seam allowances toward the garment. Once we press the seam allowances toward the garment, we're going to wrap the seam allowances under and pin in place. I like to start at the cap because there's a little extra ease and fullness here that we need to ease in, and then we'll work our way down the sides. It's also much easier if you do it on top of a tailor's ham. That way you're working on a curve. So again, what we're doing is we're just have all the seam allowances pressed toward the garment, and then we're wrapping those seam allowances underneath. When we get ready to sew, we'll sew it from the face side at about 5/16 of an inch, a little shy of 3/8, just so we make sure we capture this folded edge as we sew it. We'll pull the pins as we come to them, and then our sleeve will be attached and we'll be ready for side seams. Be careful not to catch any extra fabric in the seam allowance. So we want to hold tension on it so you don't get it captured. We're ready for sewing. Our sleeves have been sewn into the garment, our flat fell seams are completed, and now we're ready for the flat fell seams on the side seams. Now for the sleeves, we place them faces together. For the side seams, we're going to place them faces out, or wrong sides together. And what we're going to do is we're going to overlap the front side of the garment by 1/4 inch. So the seam allowance on the front is 1/2 inch, the seam allowance on the back side of the garment is 1/4 inch. So we'll have 1/4 inch of the front on the bottom exposed, and we'll be sewing at 1/2 inch. So we'll capture 1/4 inch seam allowance on the back, we'll capture 1/2 inch seam allowance on the front, then we'll wrap everything and top stitch it like we did for the flat fell seam before. Our seam finish, instead of being 3/8, will be 1/4 inch. I prepared my flat fell seams for sewing the final step on the side seams and the underarm portion of the sleeve. I've wrapped the front to the back, I've wrapped it underneath to encase the raw edge of the back seam allowance, and we'll edge stitch starting at the bottom of the garment and heading toward the sleeve. We'll do that for both sides, and then we're ready for cuffs. To prepare our cuffs for the sleeves, first thing we want to do is the leading edge, and that's the side where we're going to place our button and buttonholes. If you haven't marked them, it's not consequential at this point. We can use the sloper later on. But if you have marked them, you want to make sure that's on the edge with the marks for the button and buttonhole. We're going to go ahead and fold back to the inside on our notch on both sides at 1/2 inch and press that in place. Once we've done that, we're going to take faces together and align those notches. So we have the notch here, and we've got the notch on the other side here. Now we're going to sew 1/4 inch from here to here, anchoring this side and this side. When you sew, make sure you start at the open edge first, toward the fold. It'll be more successful that way. Sometimes if you start at the fold, you can actually make your fabric slip a little bit. So we want to make sure that's as accurate as possible. So both sides will be sewn. Once the sides are sewn, as they are in this case, we're going to go ahead and clip the corners, and that'll reduce bulk in the fold line here at the top of the cuff. Now it looks like this. You can be pretty aggressive, just clip to the stitching but not through the stitching. Then finally we'll turn it face out and it will look like this. The most successful way to do that is place your finger in here and give a little press to those seam allowances first. That'll help it turn more successfully on both sides. Sometimes I go as far as to take it to the iron and press them in place first. But this should be successful. And we'll take that and we'll flip it to the outside. And then I like to use my stiletto to help tease these corners out so that they're very angular. We want that square corner. There we are. We'll give it a final press, and then we're ready to attach them to the sleeve. Now that our side seams are complete, we'll turn the garment face in, wrong sides out, and we'll apply our cuffs. Again, at one side of the placket, align the edge of the cuff and the placket so that they're even. We're going to sew it at 1/2 inch away from the edge. Once we've completed that, we'll turn it to the face and we'll complete our stitching. We've attached the cuff on the inside. We're going to turn it to the face side now. We're going to flip the seam allowances to the inside, encasing them with the cuff, and then we're going to edge stitch right along the edge to close it all up. Our cuffs will be done and we'll be ready for the hem. In preparation for sewing our hem, I like to go ahead and pre-fold it. It's a 1/2 inch seam allowance, so we're going to fold it 1/4 and 1/4 and press in place. We're not going to sew on that line just yet. We have one more step before we do that. What we want to do is unfold this hem, and we're going to fold the facing back on itself. Right to the end of the facing portion, there'll be a notch there. And you're going to sew it 1/2 inch, that first fold line. We've sewn our facings into place at 1/2 inch, folded back on itself, aligning the notches. Right where the facing ends, come in 1/2 inch and reduce all that additional bulk. And that'll give us a much cleaner finish and a lot less bulk there. You can do the same thing on the other side. Facing gets trimmed away first, and then 1/2 inch inside of where the facing ends, clip and trim out the excess. Now we're ready to turn it to the face side. Again, always press your seam allowances open before turning. It'll make it much more successful. Get the ends turned out nicely. Make certain they're quite pointed. And now we can go ahead and fold the rest of our hem into place, and we can stitch close to that upper edge stitching right there. We have a couple choices here. We can just start right where the facing ends, and we can come up from the edge and come across and back down, or we can simply come all the way across, capturing the edge of the hem. Now that the hem is completed, the final task is simply to place the buttonholes and buttons, and we'll talk about that and show you how to do that in class.